What are we talking about? Adrian wanted to know, were the authors of the Gospels retconned into the second century? This is an objection that was leveled to him by a former believer. Yeah, it's a common one, Adrian, and again, full sympathies to your friend for being taken in by this propaganda that we have to deal with every couple months. But the idea of this image of the gospel authors either being made out of thin air, that the original gospel authors were anonymous, or that they were even fictitious for that matter, all being centered around the idea that this was to give them more influence and to prop up certain ideas about Jesus and diminish others because of the names associated with them. It's really putting the pieces that we actually have together backwards. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's just start with pretending their world is reality. And if, of course, we end up with a very silly scenario, we should consider alternatives. That's how you handle evidence.
Right.
So in their world, first of all, we have to make one assumption, that the original church, the early Christians, the people who were establishing this new religion, were circulating biographical information about the person they believed to be God. Now let's, again, note that assumption as well, that the early Christians believed Jesus was God and that he proved it by his resurrection from the dead. Even atheist scholars will admit that. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is a doxology dated to within months of the original event. So pre-2nd century. Note that. But they'd have to say that the Christians were so gullible that they would receive as doctrine not just these creeds that were circulated among audiences that may have not been literate, but for the literate crowd, they would receive information without any reason to trust it other than the fact it was written on paper. You have to assume gullibility, which again is attributing not just motive, but attributing malice, that they would celebrate and welcome false doctrine until, for some reason, 100 years or so had passed, and suddenly they started developing standards. It's a very interesting picture to make.
Yeah, it would be weird if all that time had passed and nobody had said, says who.
Yeah, or had any reason whatsoever to say, what is this?
Yeah.
It's just, hey, we got a piece of paper. We just got a letter. Let's not care who it's from. To reference Blue's Clues.
Yeah.
The second weird scenario that you have to kind of play along in order for this theory to jibe isn't just to assume an anonymity and gullibility of the original Christians, but also noting as well the original authors were alive for the majority of the establishing of Christian doctrine that we would eventually call the Bible. Now, once again, I'll fall back on even what atheists will allow. But the idea that even when we're talking about the Gospel of John, the reason why they push it to 90 AD isn't because we have a full copy available that's post-stamped according to a Gregorian calendar that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000+ years. It was because we have information inside and outside of the gospel accounts that mention the Apostle John being alive at these times in these places, and even in the book of Revelation, noting when he was imprisoned during the reign of a Roman emperor, who we also know when he was reigning, according to sources other than the Bible.
Right.
We have people like Polycarp, who of course were persecuted during reigns of other Roman emperors, who had direct association with the apostles, and noting that point as well, how we get these time frames. When we look at the manuscript evidence, and this may seem a little technical, just bear with me. P56, why do they date it to around 90 AD? Because, once again, they know it's not the original. You have a piece of something that isn't the original, so a copy generally had something that came before it.
Right.
And if we have external evidence to set the historical narrative of this, that would mean that what? This is actually placed before that time, not after that time. You don't copy something that doesn't exist yet.
Right.
But then let's once again ask the question about the circulation of these gospel accounts in the presence of the eyewitnesses. That whole rabbit trail was just to note the eyewitnesses were around during the circulation of the Gospels before the 2nd century. When you have the circulation of the Gospels, you also have to pretend that the names chosen would have given them the best possible influence, like the Apostle Peter. Any of the 4 Gospel accounts attributed to him by name?
No.
No, in fact, we have heretical sources that were thrown out that were attributed to him by name. Why? Because of the scenario you're pretending is true. If the gospel accounts were written mythologically, or rather authored mythologically, that these authors never bothered to establish any authority behind them, and then established what? This imaginary authority with a name so obscure as Matthew?
Yeah, of all the apostles, you would think that if someone was going to try to pull off something like that, they would have known enough that if you really wanted to circulate a gospel that would have cachet, say you had nefarious intent behind it,
Like the Apocalypse of Peter.
who better could you have chosen at that time than James, the half-brother of Jesus?
Or if you were ministering in India.
Because if he was, again, he was the head of the church at Jerusalem. It was James' word that, say, carried the day in Acts chapter 15, when they were trying to figure out how Gentiles could be saved. It wasn't Peter's word or James or John. It was James, the half-brother of Jesus. So if you're going to do something like that, why not go for the jugular? Why have a gospel of Mark, for goodness sake? Well, John Mark, the guy that had the sketchy track record in the book of Acts, why would you go there if your great desire was to market this thing? It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
And for goodness sake, why put a Gentile in the mix? The biggest controversy of the early church was whether or not Gentiles were allowed in this club in the first place. Yet one of your most historical narratives of your Messiah was written by a Gentile doctor from Asia Minor.
Yeah,
From
Dr.
Troas?
Luke, yeah.
So the point being made is this, and this is the first scenario you present to your friend. It's not, haha, you too, or haha, look over here. The crux of the argument is, if I pretend you're right, I have to attribute malice, gullibility, and incompetence to a full century and change of Christians undergoing persecution for the material they're reading in these Gospels. Now, once again, you can say those words. I just did, and I didn't explode. But is that a more reasonable scenario given what we know about these people, what we know about the history surrounding these people, and what we know about the material within the Gospels themselves? Now, if we go again to the actual evidence, and this is why I said they're putting the pieces together backwards, there were false gospel narratives that were written after the lifetimes of the apostles, in the 2nd century no less, like the Gospel according to Thomas, like the Apocalypse of Peter, like the Acts of James, attributing to their gospel accounts names that would get them quick influence. Only two problems. The authors were dead, and the material within them was garbage. They read it, and it was like some bizarre Greek fan fiction interweaving, Gnostic philosophy with all of these bizarre things. One example, the Apostle Peter in the Acts of Peter, he had to challenge a false prophet, and in order to establish whether his God was true and the pagan gods were false, had a flying contest around the city. And not only did Peter demonstrate this miracle, which again we wouldn't hold beyond God, started flying around the city, but the false prophet started flying too. And Peter prayed to the true and living God, and the false teacher failed to continue flying in order to demonstrate his God's power. Now, once again, isn't that kind of assuming that your God has power to begin with, which the Old Testament would throw out of hand? I understand how a Greek with pagan philosophy and culture would read these bizarre ideas into it. Foreign gods are just as powerful as yours, but you got to observe their territory. We see people even trying to teach this today. But it was stupid.
Yeah.
For no better word to describe it. They looked at this information and just said, what were you smoking? Please don't answer that, because I know you have one.
Yeah, or the infancy gospels, where, again, Jesus gets mad at one of his playmates and strikes him dead, and then thinks better about it and resurrects him.
Or to get out of getting into trouble for it.
Yeah. The gospel according to Thomas, where the big crescendo is after the resurrection. Mary is following after the disciples, and Peter says, she can't follow after you, she's a woman. And Jesus said, if she's a woman, I will make her male, and then she can follow me.
Which, again, you'd understand with the influence of Hebrew in most Greek cultures, But you read the actual gospel accounts and you realize Jesus was very much into using both men and women for
Right.
this. You read in the Gospel of Luke how the disciples were numbered among women.
Yeah.
You note the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection were women. You'd note that the first apostle was a Samaritan woman
Yeah.
sent out
Yeah.
to minister to her city. On and on it goes. But here's the point. We have to use Occam's razor, multiply scenarios and variables beyond necessity. And that means that I have to exercise more faith in what's actually there. So what is the data actually telling us? Yes, there were gospel accounts that had false names attributed to them. But the reason why people like Bart Ehrman and other liars are going to go out of their way to say the original gospel authors were anonymous isn't because we have positive evidence of no authorship. It's because we still don't have any manuscript evidence of any title page, which in of itself is also a lie. Again, I'm not the Greek speaker in the room, but euangelion tomatheion, what is that translated?
The gospel according to Matthew.
And why is it that we have a manuscript of that within the 2nd century? Because they had title pages.
Right.
Now, do we have complete copies in the 1st century? Of course not. Papyrus and
Vellum.
Thank
Yeah.
you, vellum,
Yeah.
aren't going to last that long.
Yeah.
But when we're asking the question, what evidence do we have positively? What else can we use if we don't have the original manuscripts? We have the early church fathers' quotations, which could reassemble the entire New Testament. twice over.
18,000 of them,
Yeah.
or I should say 86,000.
Yeah, with the exception of 11 insignificant verses, and all of them attribute them to the same authors we do today, with a testimony that's consistent from the late first, all the way to the 4th century. That's good. Very good, in fact. Nothing else like that in manuscript history of any other document, religious or otherwise. Second, we have not just contemporary witnesses, but later attestations of people saying this was never a question to any of us. Even people admitting they have circulated all this information in the names of the eyewitnesses who claim to have seen this great false teaching. It ultimately stands or falls, though, on the person who, like in a game of chicken, is trying to get you to flinch first when you don't have to. If they are going to make a claim, they have to provide the evidence. And it is an incredibly extraordinary claim to believe, A, that the original Gospels were circulated anonymously and not thrown out of hand. Second, that they were so gullible that they would receive them gladly and form the kind of doctrines they would die for, or at least endure torture and exile from their communities for, if they didn't know why they were trusting it. Remember that word faith again? And lastly, that in the face of actual evidence, they will only allow what's in front of them rather than what's alongside it and treat it like any other historical document. These are the sort of things that we need to keep in mind when these sort of objections. The gospel writers were anonymous. You'll hear this from atheists. You'll hear this from Muslims. The point of emphasis needs to be this, and there's different ways to handle both audiences. But you need to remember one simple thing. These were people. And while there are gullible people, not everyone is as incompetent as you'd like us to be. And if we put actual people living actual lives and making actual decisions, risky decisions, about the afterlife as well as their circumstances in this life, don't you think it's more reasonable to say they had a reason to trust these documents than no reason to trust these documents? Your move.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, we would just go back to what the eyewitnesses said themselves. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16, Simon Peter said, "We didn't follow cleverly devised fables. We made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we're eyewitnesses of his majesty." It would be very, very strange if we had eyewitnesses of the most extraordinary life on earth, and God didn't see fit to preserve for us a reliable record of what that life was all about.
Oh, but Bart Ehrman says 2 Peter wasn't written by Peter. It was actually multiple books. So I guess that's out because he's honest. Anyway,
Well,
said sarcastically.
there you go. I would disagree with Bart Ehrman, and I would say that the life, death of Simon Peter would also argue strongly against him. So,
And his own mentor that he learned textual criticism from.
yeah.
Anyway,
Bruce
going out.
Metzger, by the way.
Yeah, good guy.